If I had to break it down, I mean, year one to me comes down to three things. Number one, you as the CEO need to establish what is the culture that you're going to build. You got to be comfortable with making decisions that are the right thing for the business, irrespective of the right thing for an individual. I've been able to answer that now what question, but you only figure that out by going through that wandering period and that exploration to ask the really deep questions.
All right, so welcome to another episode of Business Exit Success. Today, I am joined by Matt Sharrers, a seasoned coach to CEOs and advisor to private equity firms. So after successfully appointing and developing his own successor at his previous company, SBI, Matt now supports other leaders through critical transitions, whether they are stepping down or stepping up within a company. Matt has a new book called The Second CEO, Accelerating Scale When Following the Founder. And this provides a first of its kind roadmap for CEOs who inherit the reins from a company's founder, which we are going to dig into much further because there is no guidance out there right now showing new CEOs how to navigate this path. So, whether you're a founder thinking about your next chapter or a leader preparing to take the baton from an existing founder, today's conversation with Matt will provide you with invaluable insights and guidance. So, Matt, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. And that was a very kind intro, so I'll try not to disappoint.
Yeah, for sure. You'll be good. So, first, again, you bring two interesting perspectives to the table in this episode, and I want to talk about both. The first, as a second CEO coming in and taking the reins from an existing founder, and second, as the CEO having to find and groom a successor to
Yeah.
take over your role. So, first, I would love to understand, how did this happen for you becoming a
Yeah.
second CEO? What was your role in the company? Did you even want to become a CEO? So maybe take us back a little bit.
Yeah. So my role in the company is I was a senior partner. We'd started SBI in 2006. Greg Alexander and Aaron Bartels and Mike Drapeau were the three co-founders. Greg was our CEO for the first 10 years. And in the summer of probably 2016, he said, "Hey guys, I think I want to go do something different." He's an incredible entrepreneur, is got 1,000 ideas an hour. And as the business was getting bigger and we were having more employees and just all the operating type stuff, it was becoming less of a joy to him. So we had a conversation about succession and was I ready? Could I be ready? So that was how it came. So I'd been in the business since the end of 2008. So I'd pretty much been there from, day two, if you will. And we had been partners together growing the business and had a great run. Did I want to be a CEO? Interesting, Tom. I told myself a narrative that I didn't want to be. But as I reflected, that came from fear of saying, I don't think I can do it, or I can't do what Greg does. And that's one of the learnings I talk about in the book is there's a tendency, especially when you work for a founder and a very dynamic founder who Greg is and was, you measure yourself and you're like, well, I don't think like that, or I don't have that experience. And you say, well, I can't do it. And what I realized was not only could I do it, and there's a lot of positive encouragement from Aaron and Mike, and obviously Greg as he left the business, and the other two partners, Scott and John. There was also the opportunity for me to recognize we're never ready, and you got to lean into your fear. And that's what I had to do. So that's how it came about. And Greg passed the torch to me in 2017.
Got it. Never ready, but just jump in head first and figure
Yeah.
it out, willing to take the leap, right?
Yeah.
So then what were the, key strategies that a second CEO coming in, what did you implement in your first year? Because that's a
Yeah.
big transition, how you communicate with the team. And I
Yeah.
think reading in your book, the way it was communicated, it was a call on Friday, and then Monday you're in CEO and Greg's gone. So,
Yeah.
what did that look like your first year?
Yeah. Well, the style with Greg, and this is one of the things I love about him, it is very definitive. We're not going to spend a bunch of time, going through this long, flowery process. I mean, the partners knew because the big
Yeah.
trigger event, Tom, was for us to buy Greg's equity, we needed an investor. So we had gone out to a process and we found an investor who was willing to come in and help the other partners buy Greg's equity. So that's what really prompted not only the ability for Greg to leave the firm because he left, but also you talk about the change in strategy. Not only was I becoming the CEO, not only was Greg leaving, but now we had an investor who required monthly updating. And we had this new thing called debt covenants and all kinds of new reporting that, for an LLC that had ran very free flow, kind of just a bunch of cowboys getting it done, right?
Mhm.
Hey, we got enough money left. Let's give ourselves a distribution at the end of the quarter. We had this methodology that Greg and Aaron had put together that allowed us to be really responsible financially. And we were at a point where the business was throwing off quite a bit of cash. So
Mhm.
we were living a great lifestyle. And all of a sudden, yeah, we could still live a great lifestyle, but we had an investor. So that was a big change. And then you had the change of me taking over in the role of CEO, not only being new to that role, but also leaving the role that I was in as the senior partner, being in charge of driving top line revenue and a lot of our new business. I'd become fairly proficient at that. And that also left the gap. So it was really what a triple whammy, right?
No
New
kidding.
capital structure, new CEO who's fumbling around, me, and a hole left by the role that I used to do and figuring that out. So we were dealing with a lot.
Man. So how did you figure that out? Like, what was the first year? I mean, again, I'm trying to think from a second CEO, maybe thinking to do this. Like, what mistakes or insights can
Yeah.
provide someone? Like, what should be their focus that first year? Is it
Yep.
building the relationship and credibility?
Yep.
I
Good
can
questions.
imagine there's 1,000 moves going on in your head, you know?
Yeah. If I had to break it down, I mean, year one to me comes down to three things. Number one, you as the CEO need to establish what is the culture that you're going to build. When you follow a founder, a business moves and it always takes on the shape of the leader, but especially a founder led business, and especially one with a personality like Greg's, which is very strong, where we had a certain way that we behaved. And for me as a CEO, I had to find my style and be the best version of Matt as opposed to a derivative of Greg and trying to be like Greg. You can't do that. It's no different. I played sports out of college. When we would change coaches, you can't be like the other coach. Whether you won a championship or you lost, you got to build the team that works for you and the style that is natural. So that's one. Two was strategy. Where were we going to play and how are we going to win? And because we now had an investor and we had certain responsibilities, we had to get crystal clear and tight on what that meant. We had been a little bit broad as a business, very entrepreneurial. Greg loved to do new things, test this, test that. So I wanted to narrow our focus to improve execution and what I thought would improve scale. And then the third thing was the team and this concept of moving from the team to your team. And most new CEOs, especially a second CEO, and I did, over 100 interviews for the book, and I was blessed to talk to a lot of skilled investors, but also second CEOs. On average, you change out about 75% of your team in that first year, not because the team they did anything wrong. You have to think about where the business is going and what's required to deliver value 3 to 5 years from now. So thinking future back instead of present forward.
Yeah, and I was going to mention it's got to be a challenge too. Like you mentioned, comparing yourself to Greg. Like all of us have our own leadership identity, and you don't have that coming in. You kind of have to figure it out and your own communication style going in. Um, I would imagine some of the challenges, making switches within the team. Those are folks that probably been there for a long time, right? And
Yes.
navigating that, but it's necessary for the culture. So how did you communicate your strategy to the team? Was it a process? Like
Yeah.
how did you navigate that path?
Initially, I didn't do it very well
Yeah.
because, I am somebody who loves speed and likes to do things quickly. I think the adage is measure twice, cut once. I was measuring once and then having to cut twice in my first year. And what allowed me to kind of recognize, especially the first 6 months, was, hey, we had a real awakening where we were getting close to tripping a covenant. We didn't have the revenue coming in. Obviously, we had cash going out the door, plus we had a payment for the debt we had taken on to buy Greg's equity. And I had to lay off 10% of the firm in my first 6 months. And that was a terrible experience. It was gut wrenching for me as a person because, having to have a conversation with people and say, hey, I got to let you go. Um, Anybody who has done that, and most leaders have, it never feels good. So that was one where I had a wake up call. I'm like, okay, how do I stabilize what we've got to do, make the right bets? Part of
Yeah.
that came down to hiring a coach to help me. Part of that came down to coalescing with the current partners and saying, all right, what are going to be our big bets? And where are we going to drive outsized value? Right? Relative, and we're a consulting business. So you can't say yes to every project. You got to stay in your
Yeah.
lane. So I think that was helpful. And then starting to get some confidence in my second 6 months in year one, recognizing that I had to make some shifts on the team, changing responsibilities, and that me taking over for Greg and just doing the things he did isn't the way to be the CEO. It's stepping back and going, how do I need to set this business up functionally to return capital to shareholders? Because my number one responsibility as a CEO is the allocation of human capital and financial capital. And I have a responsibility to the people that have invested in this company.
Yeah, 100%. And going through, some of these big transitions, stepping in, it's a lot. Maybe don't do it on their own. You mentioned three key relationships. It was it a coach, a mentor, and maybe
Yeah.
peers like
Yeah.
yourself that are going through it as well. So, how did you leverage those three categories throughout your journey? And
Yeah.
was it beneficial? What does that look like? Because that would be
Yeah.
good advice.
It was huge, and I appreciate you mentioning that because we talk about it in the book. Um, Hiring a coach who is somebody who is directly responsible for helping you reach your full potential, and they're good at coaching CEOs. And I was blessed to have a wonderful coach, a gentleman by the name of Tim Stratman, who to this day has become a close personal friend, and I still lean on him as he helps me even with the CEOs that I'm working with. So that was one. Peers, I joined World 50, so the Growth 50 group, which was for CEOs of private equity backed companies. And I found that group, especially my first couple of years, sitting with a group of CEOs, hearing their challenges, what they're dealing with, going, okay, I'm not alone. These guys and gals are navigating the same situations and being able to distill some best practices. And then I had a couple people in the role that I looked up to who had done what I was going to do, what I call the mentors.
Mm.
And I just reached out to them and said, hey, listen, Tom, I'm new in my seat. I'd like to have a relationship with you where I can pick up the phone, have a call with you every 3 weeks, bounce things off you. Are you comfortable with that? It's not a paid relationship, but paying
Yeah.
it forward. And I'm somebody who I've built a lot of great relationships over my professional career. Maybe that's one of my competitive advantages. So I was fortunate to have a couple of people who could play that role, and it was amazing.
Yeah, very vital. And just on the podcast, the guests that I've had come on who were entrepreneurs, they exit and start something new. They mention these organizations, like you mentioned, which again, anything we mentioned, I will put links in the show notes for folks listening. But like EO, Tiger 21, these other
Yeah,
organizations where there are other entrepreneurs going through the same problems you are. So you just get into a room together, strategize, and have a sounding board.
correct.
Um, Really vital.
Community matters, and having somebody, Randy Street, who is the CEO of GH Smart, the leadership advisory firm. Randy was a guy I'd known for a long time. He took over for a founder like me. Our businesses, even though we did different things, there are a ton of similarities, and he became somebody where we would just bounce ideas off each other month in, month out. And to this day is still a very close friend. And the dynamics, the founder he worked for had a similar personality to Greg. So we even had this shared experience of working for these sort of big vision, dynamic founders who had these personality types that also allowed us to just kind of share hey, how you thought about this and how have you navigated that? So it was good.
Yeah. Yeah, one strategy that you mentioned in the book, actually a few times in the book, to measure progress was scorecards. Because when you go in and you start making changes, you really don't know if they're effective or not, months down the road. So, like, can you just talk about that tool? Because I think
Yeah.
that would be even work in small businesses,
Oh
just
yeah.
having metrics and KPIs. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, and this was an idea. I mean, and I talk about it in the book. I mean, this comes from Jeff and Randy and the
Mm,
brain trust at GH Smart and the concept of a scorecard, which originally I think was started by Jeff's dad, Brad Smart, who wrote the original top grading book back in the 90s. And the way the scorecard works, it defines a role and it takes a very future focused look at what should the person in this role be tasked with doing. What are their competencies, meaning behavioral components, and then what are the accountabilities? Very clear, very sanitized, and very objective. And what it allows you to do, instead of me saying, well, what should I ask Tom to get done for the business? I say, Tom is a CFO. What does the CFO of SBI need to be accountable for? Right? And now I break those accountabilities, probably 5 to 6 of them, no more, right? A KPI attached to each accountability, whether it was, aging AR balance, right? Liquidity covenant ratio, et cetera, making sure you have total clarity in the seat, what you're responsible for. And that starts with the CEO, it
yeah.
starts with you at the top. So that's a big breakthrough. And that's something, excuse me, I recommend to all the CEOs I work with, and quite frankly, anybody I come in contact with from a business perspective.
Yeah, because a lot of again, any business owner, I don't care how big you are, we struggle with, I think, letting go of the employees that we have a really good relationship with for 10, 15, 20 years, but they're just not meeting the cut of what we need them to do in
Correct.
their role. And so we hang on to them because we feel bad or can't do it. This is a really easy way to be like, hey, this was clearly your expectations. You're not meeting it.
That's
We
it.
got to let you go. Like we got to cut the meat.
And the evolution, especially with a professional services firm where you have partners who own equity. And I was now, quote, the CEO, and two of my partners, Aaron and Mike, they owned more equity in the firm than I did. So imagine the dynamics of the guys that started the business. I'm tasked with now leading it. And, we didn't always get along perfectly on every situation. The cool thing was, though, we all had clarity and we had a shared objective of what we were trying to accomplish. And the changing of roles between them and getting to a point, the story ends really well, right? 2020, we sold the firm again. Aaron and
Yeah.
Mike were able to exit out. I continued on. It all worked out, and I'm really proud of that.
Yeah. And you had to change one of their roles, right?
Yeah,
Even though they had more equity in the firm. Talk about a challenge for a CEO stepping in.
yeah,
Um, no easy obstacle to overcome there.
yeah,
Um, so what, again, kind of making the shift here before we jump into the perspective of you you're the CEO and stepping aside. What advice would you give to someone preparing to follow a successful founder?
yeah.
Any two or three things they should focus on to kind of set them up for success?
Yep. Year one, be gentle with yourself because it's going to be the hardest professional year you probably ever had. It just is. You're learning how to be a CEO, but you're learning it in the toughest environment because typically the founder is somebody who's beloved by the employees, right? Without the founder, the business doesn't exist. Full stop. So think about all the jobs created, right? Income, families changed, etc. So it's just going to be hard. So you got to prepare yourself for the emotional ups and downs. You will get through it, but hang in there. So that's one. Two, moving to the business side is the first 90 days, even if you're an insider, spend time listening and act like an outsider. That was one of the mistakes I made, Tom, is because I had been in the business for as long as I had, seen us go from, under $1 million in revenue to where we were. It was like, I know this place. I didn't approach it with enough of a sort of beginner's mind and go
Mm.
talk to people. Hey, tell me about this. What's working here? And why should we do this? And hey, if you were in my shoes, what advice would you give me? I was just way too fast and, too many exclamation marks, not enough question marks. So that would be number two. And then number three is after you harden your strategy of where to play and how to win, trust your gut and the data that you're looking at relative to the decisions. Everybody gets a voice, but not everybody gets a vote. And sometimes when you are new in the role, you spend too much time trying to build consensus, make sure everybody's coming along. Not everybody's going to agree, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you got to be comfortable with making decisions that are the right thing for the business, irrespective of the right thing for an individual.
Yeah. Really good advice, especially the one that just sticks out again, because it can apply to any size business. Putting your ego aside a little bit and actually sitting down and meeting with the folks and getting their perspective on what are they going through, what can you do to help, and what do they expect from you, etc. Really, really good
Yeah.
advice.
Yep. Thank you.
Great. So shifting again now to the founder CEO, you're considering stepping away. How long, real quick, were you at the CEO when before you stepped out?
5 years, just like maybe five and a half, something like that.
Okay, got it.
Yeah,
So you knew that was going to happen, kind of going, and you had
I
an age
did.
or a time frame, which honestly is not very common, to be honest.
Yeah.
Um, so okay, so you got doing that. Now you have private equity experience as well. So I want to just start with what can you share from your experience in the private equity space? Because I talk to a lot of owners and I always try to tell them, look at your business from a buyer's perspective. Take yourself out of the business, remove your bias. It's difficult. I hear it. I hear you. Um, but what can you share with them about your private equity world to kind of help
Yeah.
them with that mindset shift?
Well, that we could probably spend the next
Another
3 hours
episode.
on
I know.
that, right? But here's what I would say is private equity investors, their scorecard is to return capital to their shareholders. So you may feel that they're very direct, maybe a little cold. It's not that they're cold and not caring people. The emotion of being a founder or a second CEO and all the little stories you want to tell and little cultural things you do. Okay, interesting. But
They don't care.
let's talk about how we generate a 2.2 to 3.4 times ROIC, which is return on invested capital. That is the metric. So being able to be objective and also look at yourself as an investor, because whether you're running a software company or a professional services firm or whatever the business is, a private equity firm that comes in, especially the first institutional capital, they're going to ask you to roll a significant amount of your proceeds into the deal to say, yeah, I like this business. I want to take a little money off the table, but I believe in the growth story and I'm willing to put my own dollars at work, right? Which obviously, at SBI, we're very bullish, and the firm continues to be a firm that always bets on itself. So that's the second thing is, and then third, there is a lot of value to be gleaned from private equity investors relative to pattern recognition and what they see. So if you are, as I was running a business that's a professional services firm, a consulting business, and you're working with a sponsor who has invested in multiple professional services firms who have seen different things, instead of you saying, hey, my business is different, yeah, it's different, but there's a lot of similarities. Your number one cost, labor, right? Number one issue, employee retention. If I can keep the people, probably going to do pretty well, right? Dealing with clients, like most of those mechanics are similar. So once again, beginner's mind, take what you can get from these people, but also bring your individual stamp to what's required.
Yeah. No, really good advice there. And for some folks, like some owners, private equity may not is not a right fit for everybody. Some can't stomach that. They have to get rid of people that have been there
Right.
to meet a number. So I guess what are the signals then for a founder, that indicates it's even the right time to step aside and go down this path? I guess what came up for you? What was the trigger? Maybe it was
Yeah.
multiple, etc.
Yeah. So I think I'll answer that two ways, Tom. So I think for the founders, I talk about it in the book, whether it's, hey, they love to start things, right? If I think about all the founders I interviewed for the book, David DeWolf, Christy Nova, Greg Alexander, right? The lists go on and on. They love starting things. That's their gift, right? That they bring that other people aren't founders.
Mhm.
But eventually at a point, sometimes the things that you have to do to scale a business, add employees, add infrastructure and all this, it just doesn't bring them joy and they get stuck in the muck. And as much as they try to insulate and, bring in somebody underneath them and just work on the business, eventually their creativity and their entrepreneurial edge can get stifled. So I think whether it's growth slowing sometimes, the entrepreneurial itch, wanting to do something different, wanting to start something different, there's a combination of things for the founders. For me, I was very clear. So I was 44 when I took over SBI. I'm 51 now. I wanted to have optionality at the age of 50 for my 50s. And it was 100% related to my family. All of my kids would be in college when I was 50. My wife and I would have freedom from the standpoint of time. And the freedom of time and freedom of purpose for me was a driving force. It wasn't financial freedom. Things had gone well, and we've been blessed that along the way we did okay. And I was very clear, and I was fortunate that we had a few options. And the second time we transacted, and I just said, "Hey, I'm going to be the CEO for a couple more years, get the subscription business off the ground, a few kind of key things I wanted to do. But my intention is to transition probably halfway through the hold period. So the next CEO, the third of SBI, can get their footing. That's the right thing for the employees. But
Mhm.
I'm prioritizing my family over anything else, which, if I'm honest, before that, I had prioritized work and my own career aspirations. And I didn't want to do that in my 50s.
Yeah, and it sounds like you had that's a positive pull factor, right? That you were striving to achieve. And I talk about this sometimes where it's pull versus push, because sometimes it's just straight fatigue, it's health issues that they need to get out, which are not good motivational factors to get out of a business. But yeah, I talk about this a lot because my firm, Beyond Your Exit Wealth Management, we focus on what the owner wants to do next. You knew kind of what you wanted to do next, but maybe from your private equity experience, and I know you advise on some boards, owners struggle with what they're going to do next, how
Oh,
they're going to spend their time. The phone stops ringing, your friends
yeah.
will change, right? You're not needed as much. So maybe can you just talk about that struggle and how, you coach those folks to be like, you need to start thinking about this now. Maybe you're not
Yeah.
ready to exit, but having that in the back of your mind can save the emotional stress, walking away from a deal at a table. How do you talk people through that?
Tom, I would tell you that to me is probably the biggest hurdle for any founder or second CEO, any executive leaving their role. We all like to say we're not defined by our jobs.
Yeah.
What I would say to everybody who says that is you're full of shit.
No
Honestly, we
BS.
all
That's the
are.
truth.
Present company included. And you don't realize it until you step away, especially if you're in a CEO seat where you sort of hold the trump card. You show up on a call and like, ooh, everyone, you're here. And you give the big speech and you go last and all this other nonsense that feeds our ego. And then all of a sudden, you're not that person. So your counsel is so spot on relative to understanding like, who are you away from work? But more importantly, how do you want to define this next chapter? Because you're either a husband or a wife, right? Or a partner. You are a father or a son. You're a brother or a sister, probably, right? You're a friend. Like you have all these other dimensions
Mhm.
of your life. And it
Yeah.
gives you a chance to sit back and look at that. In these last couple of years for me, that I have gone through that same transition, thinking through, well, who am I? Right. And yes, I've always wanted to coach, and I've been doing board work when I was still the CEO of SBI. But I've also had the time to investigate other things since being out of the operating role, things that I thought maybe I wanted to do, turned out I didn't. But also now sort of landing on what my next thing is, right? And this kind of big question of now what? I've been able to answer that now what question, but you only figure that out by going through that wandering period and that exploration to ask the really deep questions. And I was fortunate. I was introduced to a book called Halftime which was written in the late 90s. And it's all around moving from success to significance in the second
Love that.
half of your life. And I was a big subscriber to that methodology.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it's a challenge. And again, I know I speak to some sitting across from a client, like, okay, what do you want to do next? And it's just like, I don't want to talk about this. I'm like, no, you need to talk about this. Let's put business aside and just start having that conversation. So
Yeah.
that's such good advice. Now, to do that successfully, you need continuity in the business. Because if you step away, a lot of founders are founder driven. If they did step away at the drop of a hat, everything falls apart.
Yeah.
So how did you start identifying that person to replace your role? Did you set up metrics? When did you become confident? So that's a
Yeah.
really big challenge. Letting
It
go, number
is.
one, but finding someone.
Yeah, it is. And I think my short answer would be a little bit all of the above of what you said. Part of this started with the scorecard process, right? Sitting down with GH Smart again and saying, hey, if I'm going to transition out of this role in, late 22, that time frame, what does the business look like, at the end of 26, 27? And if we work backwards from that, how do we build a job spec for the next CEO that it isn't necessarily, hey, let's put somebody in who can run the business in 2023. Let's put somebody in who can drive value and get SBI to the next horizon relative to the long-term strategic plan. So that was one, getting that support. Then
Mhm.
two, looking inside and outside, Tom, which is something I talk about in the book. When you're going to hire for a key role, my belief is even if you've got somebody internally where you're like, I think it's her, I think it's him, you always benefit from opening up a search, having the conversations, explaining the role and what you're looking for the role to do to really capable people from the outside. Because the questions they ask you will typically reveal one of two things: blind spots and how you're thinking about the role, but also validate some hypotheses where, man, I think I got it right. Because I've just
Yeah.
talked to quite a few capable people and they're leaning into these things. So that was a big benefit. And I was fortunate that the COO at the time, Mike Hoffman, who I had hired a few years before, he revealed himself as the top candidate.
Yeah. Yeah. So, because I think some, they try to find someone internally because that might be the easier route. They know how the machine works. But for this decision, it's not the time to settle. You got to put the work in to go outside that
Yeah.
perspective and look for someone to come in. Not easy to do though. I mean, this isn't like posting a LinkedIn post and a job candidate with a resume.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's not.
what strategies did you do to find candidates for that? Was that networking, being at those events and finding some potential people and just talking to them about it? How does that
Yeah.
work?
I mean, I knew some people, but I believe in paying for great help for important decisions. I hired a search firm. And
Yeah,
I'd gotten to know Adam Prager at Korn Ferry, who led the professional services team. And he had helped me with a few key searches, and he was my trusted advisor when it came to human capital decisions.
gotcha. No, that makes sense. So, what we're coming to the end, a couple more questions here. What were some of the most significant emotional and practical challenges faced stepping away, and how did you manage them? Because I know you had that positive motivation,
Yeah,
family was top of mind,
yeah,
but there still must have been something to be like, this is really hard.
yeah. So I think the emotional challenge probably just would have been that concept of, you wake up, you look at your calendar, and all of a sudden you're like, I don't have that call anymore. And you look at your inbox, you're like, am I connected to Wi-Fi? Is my email working? Right. And you realize it
Yeah,
is. People don't need you. Um, I was ready to step away. I mean, SBI was an all out, 24/7 proposition, and I wouldn't change it.
mhm,
So I enjoyed some space for the first 6 months, played some golf, went on some crazy hikes, did a bunch of stuff with the family. Like that was important.
yeah,
Um, but I think then sort of the waking up process, and I'm still chairman of the board, so I still have enough continuity. I can
okay,
still provide some support, but I'm out of the day to day. I'm not on team calls. Like I spend my time as a board member, which is another piece of advice I share in the book. Like, you got to learn, if you're going to stay, how to be an effective board member and not operate the company.
Yeah.
And that also takes some time as a chairman with your CEO. Like, hey, what do I do? Scorecard. What do you do?
Yeah.
We don't need two CEOs.
Yeah, and that's in the book. I mean, you go into that
Yeah,
board discussion in the book, which is really helpful. And the
yeah, exactly.
scorecards and KPIs, like you break down a lot of stuff that's like visuals that someone can
Yeah,
literally copy and use. So that's some pretty good stuff.
yeah. I mean, and my goal with the book, Tom, wasn't to write a bestseller. It's a very niche topic, so it's not
Yeah,
like I've got, this mass market of a bunch of people that
yeah.
want to read this book.
Blue
Um,
ocean.
yeah, this is not blue ocean, baby. I mean, this book was written for 472 people out there that go, huh, I'm taking over for the founder. What do I do? Who do I follow? Is there a blueprint? And it was written for the investors who are backing a founder-owned business to help them make good decisions so
Yeah,
that founder and that second CEO can thrive. So that was the person or the people I was writing for. It's the operating manual, and that's my hope. So
yeah, absolutely. So coming to an end, I love to just hear you mentioned the book. It sounds like you're doing some coaching. What are
yeah.
your plans for involvement in this process going forward, and how are you helping CEOs today?
Yeah, so I do a couple things. I've got a handful of folks that I work with that are CEOs, and I coach them. No different than what Tim did for me. Usually it's a CEO who's part of a private equity backed business, probably a first time CEO. Between my 2 decades in and around private equity, but also being one in a private equity environment, dealing with multiple investors over my time as an operator, I can bring a pragmatic perspective to that. And then I also sit on the board of a handful of these companies. I invest alongside of the private equity firm and the CEO together. And my role on the board there is typically to coach the CEO, but also bring some of the go-to-market advice that I honed over the last 25 years.
Putting all that good experience to work for sure.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
much
it's
needed
fun.
experience
Yeah,
to work. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, hey Matt, I appreciate your insight today. Really great stuff. All the links again to the resources. Mentioned a lot of great books. I'll put everything in the show notes for folks listening. And I appreciate your time coming on today, man.
Tom, thanks. And listen, man, I appreciate what you're doing because I will tell you, people planning for post exit thinking financially, but also just the mental side, they need it. So God bless you for having the courage to start what you did and do what you do. Because
Appreciate it.
I hang out with a lot of people now who are still trying to answer that question of now what. So kudos to you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Matt. You take care,
Okay,
man.
brother. Thanks,
Take care.
Tom.